When empires feel cornered, they don't attack. They debate. The skyline of Nairobi buzzed with anticipation. What was supposed to be a routine diplomatic visit had transformed into a moment of unprecedented geopolitical theater. General Michael Langley, commander of the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, was on Kenyan soil, ostensibly for high-level security consultations with East African leaders. But on the second day of his visit, standing before journalists at the Kenyatta International Conference Center, he dropped a verbal grenade. I invite President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso to a public conversation, live, on television, about African sovereignty, security, and the future of U.S.-Africa relations. The room froze. Reporters looked at one another. Was this real? Langley continued. We believe in dialogue. If the new leaders of West Africa are certain of their path, let them explain it. Not behind closed doors, but before the people they claim to serve. By the time the live stream cut, Twitter, X, across the continent had exploded. Pan-African activists called it a trap. Western analysts called it historic. Military strategists called it a miscalculation. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré was calm. Wearing his red beret, seated at a modest wooden desk, he made a short statement to his nation and to the world. General Langley has requested a debate. I accept. I will come to Nairobi, but I am not coming alone. I carry with me the voices of Africa's broken treaties, stolen minerals, and unfinished revolutions. The age of unchallenged American influence was ending not in war, but in words, and for the first time the West would have to defend its legacy in Africa on Africa's soil. One represented the empire's grip, the other, its unraveling. The announcement traveled faster than diplomats could react. Within hours, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and France 24 were battling for broadcasting rights. The venue was confirmed. University of Nairobi's Taifa Hall, a symbolic ground for freedom struggles in East Africa. The American embassy issued a follow-up press release framing the debate as a model of democratic transparency. But behind the scenes, Washington was nervous. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It wasn't even just about the Sahel. This was about an ideological line being drawn across Africa, between those still aligned with Western interests and those breaking free with fire in their eyes. Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a leader. He was now a movement. He'd cut ties with France, expelled Western troops, nationalized strategic mines, and most recently, formed a Sahelian confederation with Mali and Niger. Langley knew this, but he believed a controlled conversation could tame the fire, or at least reframe it as reckless emotion. What he underestimated was how much of the continent had already chosen sides. In Kenya, youth groups flooded social media. Traoré speaks for us. Langley, defend the CFA franc. No more lectures, debate him. On the streets of Nairobi, murals of Traoré appeared overnight, his face painted beside slogans like, Africa is not a base. The time for silence is over. Langley's advisors urged caution, but the American general, confident in decades of military diplomacy, pressed forward. If Africa wants to question our legacy, let them do it face to face. I've got nothing to hide. Langley came with strategy, Traoré came with history, and now both would face off, not in battle, but in the purest arena of power, the battle for narrative. He walked off the plane not like a guest, but like a message. On the morning of the debate, Ibrahim Traoré's aircraft touched down at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport under overcast skies. There were no red carpets, no ceremonial military honor guards, just roaring crowds held back by barricades, chanting his name like he was a returning liberator. Traoré, Traoré, we are with you. He stepped off the ramp in full uniform, combat boots, desert fatigues, red beret, no suit, no tie, no compromise. Beside him walked the ministers of defense from Mali and Niger, flanking him not as aides, but as representatives of a new order. Traoré's first stop? Not a hotel, not a presidential residence. He went directly to Kariobangi, a low-income neighborhood in Nairobi, where Pan-African youth had erected a public screen to host community debates about neocolonialism. There, standing in a circle of rusted shipping containers, Traoré spoke. Africa has never lacked courage. It has lacked microphones. Tonight, we speak not to prove ourselves to them, but to remind ourselves who we are. That speech went viral within an hour. Meanwhile, Inside the heavily guarded American compound in Nairobi, Langley met with embassy staff. He was briefed on the optics. 68% of online sentiment in East Africa backed Traoré. Kenyan student unions had publicly endorsed the Pan-African bloc. Analysts warned, any sign of Western arrogance will be disastrous. Langley adjusted his tie. He didn't show fear. He had survived Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. But what awaited him tonight was something no drone, no intel, no boots-on-ground operation could prepare him for. A man who didn't want a seat at the table. A man who wanted to flip the table over. One came with policy briefs, the other with the grief of centuries. And in Nairobi, their worlds would collide under lights, cameras, and a continent watching. This was not a conversation. It was a confrontation disguised by microphones. The hall was electric. Taifa Hall, usually reserved for academic forums, had been transformed into a global broadcast set. 2 podiums, 2 flags, 1 American, 1 Pan-African. The Kenyan flag stood in the center, symbolizing neutrality, or perhaps nervousness. International media crews filled the balcony. Students, professors, diplomats, and activists packed the floor. There were murmurs in French, Kiswahili, English, and Diula. But one sentiment echoed in every language. Africa is about to speak for itself. The moderator, a renowned Kenyan journalist, welcomed the crowd. Tonight's discussion centers on the future of Africa, its security, governance, and the meaning of sovereignty in a multipolar world. With us are 2 guests whose visions could not be more different. Then, the camera turned to General Michael Langley, sharply dressed, composed, firm. He spoke first. Our mission in Africa has always been to support stability, combat extremism, and ensure development. AFRICOM is not an occupier, it's a partner. He pointed to successful U.S. training missions, investment in regional peacekeeping, and coordination with African Union forces. He ended with a firm tone. We are here because Africa matters to us, and we stand by our allies. There was applause, controlled, polite. Then came Traoré. He didn't touch the podium. He walked in front of it, standing closer to the people than the cameras. The general says Africa matters, but to whom? For what? The room fell silent. Every partnership you offered came with strings. Strings that choked our sovereignty, our economies, our dignity. He paused. You sent soldiers to train ours, but for whose war? You offered aid, but demanded access. You praised elections, and then supported leaders who betrayed their people. Applause erupted, not polite, not hesitant, explosive. Langley kept his composure, but his jaw stiffened. Africa does not need permission to govern itself, Traoré continued. We need room to grow without surveillance, without sanctions, without sabotage. What began as a forum turned into a trial, where history itself sat in the witness chair and one continent began to cross-examine its past. Beneath every handshake, Africa had learned to check for a chain. The moderator turned the focus to the CFA franc, France's colonial currency still used in West Africa, backed by the French treasury, controlled from Paris. Traoré seized the moment. Let us talk about currency. You want to debate security, but how can a man feel secure when his money is printed in another land? He pointed directly at Langley. The United States would never allow the dollar to be printed in Beijing, yet you call us unstable when we demand the same dignity. The crowd clapped in unison. Langley waited for silence. Monetary reform, Langley replied, is a national decision. AFRICOM doesn't dictate fiscal policy. Traoré leaned forward, voice cold and surgical. But your soldiers protect the regimes that won't reform it. Your embassies pressure the governments that try. You don't dictate. You design the cage and let others lock the door. A wave of gasps swept across the audience. The moderator quickly pivoted to military presence. General Langley, critics say AFRICOM has more bases than allies on the continent. Your response? Langley cleared his throat. We have installations to respond to transnational threats, terrorism, piracy, trafficking. Without our presence, those threats would destabilize entire regions. Traoré didn't even wait. You are the threat. The room froze. Mali expelled your partners. The skies are quieter. Burkina Faso chased out your so-called advisors. Attacks dropped. Niger took back its uranium. Its people stood taller. He looked directly into the camera. Africa's enemy is not chaos. It is control disguised as assistance. The debate was no longer about ideas. It was about ownership of Africa's story. And Traoré was not debating to win. He was debating to remind a continent. You were never defeated, just distracted. You cannot claim to defend a people if you deny them the right to speak freely, to choose fully, and to rise without foreign permission. The moderator posed a pointed question. President Traoré, critics argue that your methods, military transition, media control, and swift nationalizations, are undemocratic. Are you replacing one form of control with another? A calculated pause. Traoré folded his hands. Democracy, he said, is not the presence of ballots. It is the absence of puppeteers. Gasps. Then silence. You speak of press freedom, but for 60 years, African voices that questioned the West were silenced. Not by tanks, but by trade deals. Not by coups, but by coups you called constitutional. He turned to Langley again. Your governments never objected when corrupt leaders stayed in power for decades, so long as they signed contracts. But now you panic because we say, no more. Langley, cornered yet composed, responded, We respect national sovereignty, but we must also ensure regional stability. A destabilized Sahel is a gift to terrorist networks. Traoré's voice sharpened. Terrorism thrives in poverty. You flew drones but never built hospitals. You trained soldiers but never trained doctors. What did you expect to grow? The crowd thundered with applause. Security, he declared, is not the presence of soldiers. It is the presence of hope. Langley's tone grew defensive. President Traoré, Burkina Faso has received millions in U.S. security assistance. Do you deny that? Traoré's eyes narrowed. You don't give aid, you lease compliance. You call it assistance. We call it an invoice with bullets. The cameras caught the expression on Langley's face, stone but shaken. In that moment, the debate was no longer about Burkina Faso or AFRICOM or Sahel policy. It was about the deeper question: who truly owns the right to define Africa's destiny? In that hall, the applause did not belong to one man. It belonged to a continent reclaiming its voice. The debate, now trending globally as Langley vs. Traoré, had turned from political exchange into philosophical reckoning. The moderator shifted to foreign military bases in Africa, asking both men, Are foreign bases compatible with sovereignty? Langley responded methodically. Our bases are built with host government consent. We work in cooperation with national forces to stabilize fragile states, he gestured to the audience. Ask Somalia, Djibouti, or Niger before the rebellion. Our presence saved lives. Traoré responded with none of the diplomatic caution. Consent under debt is not consent. Consent under puppet regimes is not legitimacy. If a man signs a deal with a knife at his throat, do you call it cooperation? The room rumbled. Africa's land should not be negotiated by leaders who were funded by the very powers they are supposed to negotiate with. That is not diplomacy, that is colonialism wearing a suit. Applause shook the hall. Langley shifted uncomfortably, but tried to steer the narrative back. And what of Russian and Chinese influence? Are you not simply exchanging one empire for another? Traoré's response was thunderous. We are not choosing Russia, we are choosing rotation. We are not betting on China, we are unlearning dependence. If we engage with others, it is as partners, not as property. He turned again to the people. We are not trading masters. We are breaking mirrors built to reflect our inferiority. A student in the audience stood and shouted, Speak louder, Captain. They need subtitles in Washington. Laughter, applause. The entire hall was on its feet. This was not a debate. This was an exorcism of 500 years of imposed silence, and the crowd, once passive observers, had become the final jury. One question, no script, no filter, that's when the debate turned into a reckoning. The moderator, sensing the moment's weight, leaned in with a personal challenge. President Traoré, if the United States withdrew all aid, all military cooperation, and all diplomatic ties tomorrow, can Burkina Faso stand alone? The hall went still. The lights, the cameras, the world, waiting. Traoré nodded slowly. No nation truly stands alone, but some stand free. He stepped forward, off the stage, speaking directly to the people now. If they withdraw their aid, we'll grow what we eat. If they cancel our loans, we'll print our own currency. If they shut their embassies, we will open schools. Let it all fall, if that is the price of standing up. He raised a clenched fist. Freedom is not given, it is grown through fire. The audience erupted. Chanting echoed, "Africa! Africa! Africa!" General Langley, under pressure, delivered a final, measured response. Isolationism is not sovereignty. Global challenges demand global cooperation. The United States remains committed to Africa, but we will not fund regimes that undermine stability. Traoré turned to him sharply. "Then you admit it. Your funding is not help. It is leverage. And your commitment is not to Africa, but to those who obey." Silence from Langley. Cameras flashed. Social media exploded. The balance had tipped. Traoré had not just countered Langley, he had cornered the entire Western diplomatic narrative. The world expected a debate between two men. What it got was a continent putting the empire on trial and refusing to accept parole. When applause becomes thunder, even generals start to hear the storm. By the 90-minute mark, the world was watching in record numbers. Over 80 million people were tuned in across TV, mobile, and live stream platforms. From Johannesburg to Dakar, from Atlanta to Port-au-Prince, screens glowed in silence, eyes locked on two podiums, one representing 500 years of dominance, the other symbolizing a rebirth. Then came the final exchange. Langley attempted one last pivot. "Mr. Traoré, no system is perfect, but the West has provided infrastructure, health systems, education. Can we not build together?" Traoré didn't blink. "You built nothing. You extracted. You rebranded our stolen goods as investment. You trained our elites to serve you, and when we asked for respect, you gave us weapons." He turned to the crowd once more. "We don't need to build together with those who never built for us. We will build as brothers and sisters." Within, a woman in the back screamed, "Preach!" More chants, more fists raised. Langley stood silent. The composure of his uniform couldn't shield him from the truth now echoing in every African capital. The emperor had not just been challenged, he had been answered. The moderator thanked both guests, but it was clear who owned the night. Langley exited under protective escort. Traoré walked out through the crowd, hugging students, raising fists, smiling. In that moment, the military man looked more like a prophet than a president. No matter what headlines would be spun the next morning, Washington had lost more than a debate. It had lost its moral high ground, and Africa had reclaimed its voice, not by rebellion, but by reason. Empires don't crumble in silence. They collapse under the weight of voices they can no longer ignore. The next morning, the world woke up changed. Global headlines split sharply. Traoré dismantles U.S. narrative in Nairobi showdown. Al Jazeera, General Langley faces unprecedented public challenge in Africa. Politico, the debate heard across the continent. African Union Press Digest. But in Burkina Faso, the news wasn't about Langley. It was about the people. Civic assemblies were formed overnight to discuss how each province could end dependency on foreign aid. Radio stations in Mali and Guinea aired replays of the debate on loop. Universities in Nigeria launched instant seminars titled Decolonization in Real Time. A movement once mocked as fringe now had a face, a voice, and a platform. Ibrahim Traoré returned to Ouagadougou not as a victor, but as a mirror reflecting what millions had felt for decades. "He did not win," said a Kenyan youth leader on a viral video. "He reminded us that we were never supposed to beg to be free." In Washington, AFRICOM issued a tightly worded statement. The United States remains committed to open dialogue and mutual respect with African partners. But the truth was obvious. The old script had failed. No amount of military cooperation, no layers of diplomacy, no army of think tanks could undo what that debate unleashed: a public Pan-African awakening. Weeks later, leaders from the Sahelian bloc, Congo, and parts of East Africa formed a new continental media agency, Vox Africa Unchained, to control their narratives without Western filters. Langley never issued a personal follow-up. Traoré, meanwhile, issued a message broadcast continent-wide. "Africa is not rising. Africa has always stood. They just weren't listening before. Now they can't ignore us." In Nairobi, two men stood behind podiums. One defended a past dressed as partnership. The other lit a match that might burn through every lie ever sold to a stolen continent. And in that fire, a new Africa found its voice. Not borrowed, not begged, but born. The debate is over. The era has changed.